This is the Seth Mila Program.
In a previous episode, we talked about some of the things that make this country great. But there are some areas where we can do better. Every day, someone experiences hunger. Every day, someone struggles that their home or vehicle needs some major repair. And every day, someone struggles with addiction. I believe just about everyone wants a world where people suffer less. So why do we disagree so passionately about how to make that happen? Some place their confidence in government and government programs. Others place their confidence in people. So today, we're going to explore two very different visions of compassion. Both propose a way to make things better, but they begin with two very different ideas about mankind and how lasting change really happens. Which vision has stood the test of history, and which one offers the greatest reason to hope? So recently, one word has found its way into all kinds of conversations, political speeches, TV interviews, college classrooms, and that word is socialism. And some people believe it's the most effective and compassionate way to build a society. Others believe history has shown it leads to poverty, oppression, and the loss of freedom. But here's the problem. Many people use the word without ever really defining what it actually means. It's a hot button. It's a trigger word. It's, popular. What's even more confusing, countries like Denmark and Sweden are often called socialist, while their own leaders generally describe them as a market economy with extensive social welfare programs. So before we compare ideas, I think it's kind of important that we need to understand what we're actually talking about. But this episode is not going to be about economics, and it's not about political parties, and it certainly is not telling you how to vote. It is, however, about something much more fundamental. It's about compassion. More specifically, it's about two very different visions of compassion. Both, I truly believe, at their heart, want to help people. Both believe the poor should be cared for. Both believe suffering should be reduced. Both desire a better world. So, if they share many of the same goals, why do they arrive at such different solutions? I think the answer begins with a question that's kind of deeper than politics. And that is, what's mankind's greatest problem? If our greatest problem is primarily an unfair system, well, it's easy. Then changing those systems becomes our highest priority. But if our greatest problem lies within the human heart, then lasting change has to begin somewhere very different. So over the next few minutes, we're going to look honestly at history. We're going to try to define our terms very carefully, and we're going to examine what happened when different ideas were put into practice. And then we're going to compare those ideas with the picture of compassion presented throughout Scripture, the Bible. Now, look. My goal, I hope you know this by now, my goal is never to try to tell you what to think. It's simply to invite you to think deeply. I believe that when we understand the two visions of compassion, one stands apart, not simply because of what it teaches, but because of what it has inspired ordinary people to do for thousands of years. So let's begin by, trying to answer kind of a difficult question. What exactly is socialism? All right, so before we can actually compare two visions of compassion, we need to make sure we're talking about the same thing. One of the challenges today is that the word socialism is used to describe, everything from Scandinavian countries to Cuba to Russia. And sometimes it's used accurately, and a lot of times it's not. Sometimes it's simply used as a political label without a lot of thought put to it at all. So let's slow down just a minute, define a term or two, At its core, socialism is an economic and political philosophy that it argues that society's major resources and industries should be owned or controlled by the community, usually through the government, rather than primarily by private individuals and business. Now, this is not a new idea. This actually began taking shape in Europe during like the late 1700s and early 1800s. Many people reacted to the very difficult working conditions created during the Industrial Revolutions. Think about it. You probably already know this. Factories were expanding. Cities were growing very rapidly. And some workers endured very long hours, extremely dangerous conditions with low wages. And many thoughtful people looked at these problems and said, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And they were right. There needed to be improvements. Seriously. It's important also to recognize something here, that the desire to help struggling people was not wrong. In fact, I think most of us would agree that compassion for people in difficult circumstances is a very good thing. It's what we're called to do. The question never really has been whether or not we should care. I think the question that we create is how. As I understand it, as socialist ideas developed, different thinkers proposed different solutions. Some believed government should own everything. Others believed private ownership should continue, but with government playing a much larger role in directing the economy and redistributing wealth. And that's one reason the word socialism becomes, kind of confusing. Not everyone means the same thing when they use it. Today, you'll often hear another phrase, democratic socialism. That seems to be a very popular term right now. Unlike revolutionary socialism, democratic socialism seeks to achieve many of its goals through democratic elections rather than revolution. Supporters generally advocate for a larger role for government in providing economic security and social services, though there are important differences among democratic socialist movements around the world. Then there's actually a third term that causes even more confusion, social democracy. And this is where countries like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland are often mentioned. Many Americans refer to these countries as socialist, but those nations generally describe themselves quite differently. They have competitive market economies. People own the businesses. Private property is very well protected, and entrepreneurs start companies. Innovation is encouraged, so their economies actually remain largely capitalist. The major difference is that they also maintain extensive social welfare programs funded through comparatively higher taxes. And that's why many economists describe these countries as social democracies rather than socialist economies. Now, that distinction is important because if we're going to compare ideas honestly, we need to compare the right ideas. And otherwise, we just end up debating, labels instead of understanding reality. As you'll discover, hopefully, as we have our conversation, not only today, but in future conversations, words matter and their definitions matter, and history really matters. And perhaps more importantly, ideas matter. Because every idea about how society should function begins with an idea about people. Who are we? Why do we struggle? And what is the best way to help one another? Those questions have shaped civilizations for centuries, and they're exactly where we're headed next. I think we've done a pretty good job of defining the terms. I don't want to get bogged down into that, but I think we've done a pretty good job. What happens when these ideas move from the classroom into the real world? And that's what we're seeing now is ideological principles being discussed and wanting to be put into practice into the real world. And it's very important before you take an ideology and make it a reality, you got to understand it and you got to think about, what are the consequences? You got to think things through. And in order to do that, history is a remarkable teacher. And history doesn't care about campaign speeches, and it doesn't care about slogans. History records what happens. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, a number of governments have adopted socialist or Marxist-inspired economic systems to varying degrees. Each country had its own culture, its own history, and its own leaders, yet many faced remarkably similar challenges. For example, let's look at Venezuela. Just a few decades ago, Venezuela was one of the wealthiest countries in South America, blessed with enormous oil reserves. Over time, however, successive governments greatly expanded state control over major industries and implemented extensive price controls and centralized much of the economy, meaning the government controlled most of the economy. The goals are understandable. They wanted to reduce inequality, provide for the poor, and increase economic fairness. Those were the stated goals. Now, were those the goals of the actual leaders that were in charge of putting all this into place? That's up for debate. But I don't want to digress there. Today, Venezuela has experienced years of severe inflation, shortages of food and medicine, declining productivity, and one of the largest migration crises in modern history as millions of their citizens left the country seeking better opportunities elsewhere. So let's look at Cuba, shall we? Now, for decades, Cuba's maintained a centrally planned socialist economy. Visitors often comment on the friendliness of the Cuban people and the beauty of the island and its rich culture. Many Cubans, however, face significant challenges in everyday life. Food shortages have become common. Basic medicines are very difficult to obtain most times. Keeping vehicles running, ridiculous. Families frequently experience lengthy power outages, sometimes days or weeks long. That interrupts daily life, spoils the food in your refrigerator, and just makes everyday routine tasks even more difficult. Many consumer goods that people in other countries take for granted are really hard to find. Housing in many communities has deteriorated after decades of limited investment and aging infrastructure. Young people, in particular, often see few opportunities to build prosperous futures in Cuba, and they have left by the hundreds of thousands leaving Cuba, searching for greater economic opportunity, again, elsewhere. And again, the intentions, I'm going to have to make an assumption, and I'm going to assume taking the side of generosity of their heart, which may or may not exist. But we're going to assume that the intentions behind some of the government policies were rooted in the desire for greater equality. It's hard to argue that when you know the history of the Cuban revolution and how it came to power. And so I'm not going to stick there, but let's just say, for argument's sake, that the intention was to have greater equality, to have a better life for the Cuban people. But after more than 60 years under a centrally planned socialist system, Cuba continues to struggle with chronic shortages, aging infrastructure, and limited economic opportunity, like we said. Supporters of the Cuban government often point to the long-standing U.S. embargo and other external pressures as major contributing factors, and I believe it has been a contributing factor, but it is not the main factor. Critics argue that centralized economic planning and extensive government control have played a significant role in creating the country's current conditions. That, I believe, is the more accurate definition. And then I don't think we can have a discussion about socialism without looking at the Soviet Union. In Soviet Russia, For decades, it was central planners that attempted to direct nearly every aspect of the economy. Groups of individuals got together, quote unquote, experts, and designed every aspect. Factories, agriculture, transportation, production, all of it. It was all government designed, heavily regulated, and implemented. The hope, as it is stated, was that experts could coordinate the resources more efficiently than millions of individual decisions made through free markets. However, the Soviet economy became increasingly stagnant. Shortages were very common. Innovation slowed, and eventually the system collapsed under its own weight. There are many reasons historians point for these outcomes. Corruption had a big part of it, poor leadership, international pressures, and economic mismanagement. And in some cases, it's just because of the authoritarian government that concentrated enormous power in the hands of a few elite individuals. Rarely, history is explained by one factor alone, right? But one pattern is kind of hard to ignore here. When the government acquires greater control over economic decisions, they also acquire greater power over people's daily lives. History reminds us that power, no matter how well intended, carries enormous responsibility. And another thing that is very, very hard to ignore is that when power is concentrated among a few people, those few people are tempted by that power. They're tempted by the money. They're tempted to keep it for themselves instead of doing for others. It's part of who we are. We are greedy individuals. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're talking about government plans, not people yet. Okay, so where does that leave countries like Sweden and Denmark and others, right? As we discussed earlier, they're often presented as proof that socialism works. But their economies are largely built upon private ownership and competitive marketplaces, entrepreneurship, and strong property rights. They differ significantly from centrally planned socialist economies. Their extensive welfare systems exist alongside vibrant market economies rather than replacing them. And that's an important distinction, because if we compare unlike systems, we're going to reach misleading conclusions. So what can we say honestly after looking at history? I think three things here. First, good intentions alone are not enough. Second, ideas, they have consequences. And third, every economic system is ultimately built upon assumptions about human nature. Now, that last observation may be the most important one of all, because before we decide how society should be organized, we have to answer, I think, a much deeper question. What is it exactly about human beings that creates poverty and injustice and greed and suffering in the first place? That's the question history raises. And it's the question that Christianity answers very differently. Being kind of an amateur history buff, I love biographies, autobiographies, and films and so forth that tell us about how nations were built and grew and developed and so forth. I even trudged through Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy. It was chewy. Fascinating. Whew, but chewy. Anyway, history can tell us what happened, but history cannot tell us why it happened. To answer that question, I think we have to look at something deeper. What is the greatest problem facing mankind? The answer to that one question shapes everything else. How we view government, how we view compassion, how we view justice, even how we understand human nature, how we understand ourselves, if that's possible. Many political and economic philosophies begin by looking outward. They see poverty, they see the suffering and the inequality and the unfair systems. They see mankind's greatest problems. And if that's your diagnosis, then changing the system naturally becomes your highest priority. You see the system as being the problem, so you put forth all of your efforts in fixing the system. However, Christianity begins somewhere entirely different. It begins with the human heart. And this is what I see as the biggest difference between the two visions of compassion. Instead of a governmental body passing laws and regulations that require businesses and individuals to hand over control of their assets to be administered, Christianity encourages people to look within their own hearts, to see people and themselves as Jesus saw them, and then do what they can to help those people in need. In Galatians 6:2, Paul writes, "Carry each other's burdens." That places a lot of responsibility on us. And obviously, it's easier to let a governmental body do it all. But at what cost? See, the issue isn't that some people are greedy or that some people want to take advantage of others for their own selfish gain. No, the issue is that we are all capable of these things. Sin is the default setting of our hearts. So we just simply cannot look to a government to solve our social issues. Government regulations and laws do not address the problem of the human heart. Jesus didn't come to merely create a better political system. He came to transform people, because transformed people build better families, better churches, better businesses, better communities, and better societies. Think about it for a moment. If greed is the real problem, changing the economic system doesn't eliminate greed. Greedy people can exist in a capitalist society, and do. Greedy people can exist in socialist societies, and do. Greedy people exist everywhere. The same is true of pride and corruption and selfishness. All of these are human problems, heart problems, and not just political ones. So Christianity says that lasting change begins when hearts are changed, when people begin to love God. That's how they begin to love their neighbors differently. Eventually, they become more generous, more forgiving, more compassionate, not because a law requires them to, but because love changes the way they want to do things. And that doesn't mean that governments have no role. Obviously, throughout history, governments have protected citizens, maintained order, provided important public services, all very critical. But Christianity teaches that no government, no matter how well designed, can accomplish only what God can do. Only God, in my opinion, can change the human heart. And perhaps that's the greatest difference between these two visions of compassion. One begins by asking, how do we build a better system? The other begins by asking, how do we become better people? Yeah, okay. Now, I know there's a lot of criticism about Christianity. I've heard probably most of it throughout the years. You've maybe heard it too, or even said it. Christianity is just a bunch of rules. Don't do this, don't do that, go to this church, not that church, conform to this denomination, not that denomination, read your Bible, no, not that Bible, this Bible. And listen, if that's all that Christianity was, I got to admit to you, I wouldn't find it particularly compelling either. But that is not the message Jesus taught. Christianity isn't primarily about changing someone's behavior from the outside. It's about God changing someone from the inside, and then watching their behavior begin to change because of that. That's an important distinction. Rules can tell you not to steal from your neighbor, but rules can't make you love your neighbor. A law can tell you not to harm someone, but it can't make you care about them. Of course, government can require you to pay taxes that support programs for people in need, but it can't inspire you to sit beside someone who's lonely. It can't move you to forgive someone who hurt you. And it can't prompt you to notice the struggling family living 3 doors down. And it certainly can't bloom love from a heart that was once stone. Christianity asks for something much deeper. Jesus said the greatest commandments were to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Not just tolerate your neighbor, not simply avoid hurting your neighbor. Love your neighbor. You may be thinking, love my neighbor? Love people? I don't even like people. I get it. I have felt that too. Yes, I have. Not enough Christians admit that there are days where we absolutely don't like people. And I really believe that this is because we're afraid to admit our sins to the world and then be called hypocrites. The big difference is that when we recognize that we're feeling that way, we go to God in prayer. We ask for forgiveness. We are forgiven, and then we have our hearts renewed where we can actually love people. It's absolutely true. I experience this on a regular basis. I've also had the privilege of seeing compassion from a much closer perspective. I've been involved with several ministries over the years, either directly in helping them or interviewing them. I've interviewed a large number of people who founded community programs and ministries. I've met people who saw a problem in their neighborhood, in their church, the city, whatever, and instead of saying, somebody ought to do something about that, they did. And after watching these people work, I've developed an observation. The closer compassion gets to the person who needs it, the more effective it becomes. And I'm certainly not claiming that every small ministry succeeds or that every government program fails. No, I'm telling you just what I have personally observed. Small, community-oriented programs often know something that large institutions just simply can't know as easily. They know the person. They don't just know what a family needs, they know why. Maybe the dad lost his job, maybe mom is sick, maybe the car broke down, which meant someone couldn't get to work, which meant the paycheck was smaller, which meant the electric bill didn't get paid. And suddenly, what looks like a financial problem on a piece of paper is actually, it's a transportation problem or a medical problem or a childcare problem. The person sitting across the table knows enough about that family, that individual, to recognize the difference. And that is really powerful. Real life rarely fits neatly into a box on an application. I've interviewed founders of community programs who didn't begin with a business plan or a government grant. They began with an idea. One person, one idea. They saw that someone needed help, and they had an idea. They wanted to act on that idea. They prayed about it and felt God encouraging them. Sometimes that became a food ministry, a pregnancy resource center, an addiction recovery program, all of that. And because these programs are often close to the people they're serving in the community, they can ask the different questions of, what do you actually need? And that's very different from simply asking, what program do you qualify for? Now, government programs absolutely have capabilities that small ministries do not. They can operate on enormous scale. Social Security, Medicare, emergency management, public health. These programs serve millions of people. A neighborhood ministry could not possibly replace all of that, nor should we expect it to. But scale comes with quite a challenge. The larger a system becomes, the harder it can be to see the individual inside it. And Christianity is relentlessly individual. Jesus taught crowds, but he repeatedly stopped for one person, a blind man, a grieving mother, a woman everyone else wanted to avoid. Jesus saw people, not just categories, not demographics. He saw people. And that's something I've seen reflected in many of the ministries that I've encountered. They don't just simply distribute resources, they build relationships. Someone may receive groceries, but they also hear, "Hey, how are you doing? And how can we be praying for you?" Someone can receive some financial assistance, but somebody asks, "You don't mind, how did you get here? And how can we help you move forward?" Someone struggling with addiction isn't simply handed information. Someone may walk beside them through recovery. That's the difference between a transaction and a relationship. And I believe relationships are where some of the most meaningful change happens, because sometimes the thing a person needs isn't just money, it's accountability or encouragement or wisdom. Maybe it's somebody willing to tell them the truth, even when it's hard to hear. And that's why I've become convinced that compassion works especially well when it's personal, when the person providing the help can look into the eyes of the person receiving it, when they know their name, when they understand their story, when success isn't simply measured by how much assistance was distributed on this particular time frame. There's no argument that we do need the institutions. We need the large organizations. We need government to perform legitimate functions that individuals and small communities simply cannot perform on their own. But we should never allow those institutions to convince us that compassion has to be outsourced. Your neighbor isn't a government program. Your neighbor's a person. And perhaps the most powerful form of compassion still begins exactly where it began 2,000 years ago, when one person sees another person hurting, moves a little closer and says, "How can I help?" For example, you've heard the phrase "Good Samaritan." We use it to describe when somebody does something nice for somebody else. Just the other day, I was walking into a coffee shop and, kind of got in, and I looked behind me and there was a woman, coming in. A guy held the door open for her, and she said, "Oh, thank you for being such a good Samaritan." That phrase has its roots in the Bible. In the book of Luke, starting with chapter 10, verses 30 to 35, Jesus describes what it means to love your neighbor in the parable of the Good Samaritan. He says, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.'" What's important to know about this story, Samaritans and Jews had deep religious, cultural, and historical differences. In other words, they didn't much care for each other. So this wasn't necessarily someone you would expect to stop. But he did. He treated the man's wounds. He helped him get somewhere safe. He paid for his care. One person, one need, one decision to help. And more than 2,000 years later, we're still telling that story.
And now it's time for
5 random
facts.
It's once again the opportunity for me to help you out if you ever find yourself in that awkward social setting where the conversation has come to a lull. In 2016, Arizona grandmother Wanda Dench texted what she thought was her grandson's number with a Thanksgiving dinner plan. Instead, the message went to a teenager, Jamal Hinton. After exchanging photos and realizing the mistake, Jamal jokingly asked whether he could still come over and get a plate. Wanda said, "Yes, of course you can." He actually showed up. And what began as a wrong number text became a genuine friendship. They've continued celebrating Thanksgiving together year after year after year, and eventually even became business partners. Then there's a story that during renovations at Atlanta's historic Plaza Theater in 2023, a contractor discovered an old wallet hidden behind a wall. It belonged to Mrs. Floy Culbreth, who had apparently lost it at the theater in 1958. The theater owner used the contents of the wallet and a little bit of internet detective work to locate Culbreth's daughter. Her mom had died a few years earlier, but the daughter was presented with the wallet 65 years after it disappeared. Inside the wallet were some old photographs, a library card, raffle tickets, and other pieces of her mom's life. In 2019, Dan Levine went swimming off the coast of Cornwall, England, and lost his custom-made wedding ring in the ocean. He posted about it online, but understandably assumed it was long gone. The next day, however, Gary and Emma Spires were exploring tidal pools nearby when they noticed a small black fish swimming beneath a ledge. Gary looked a bit closer. Directly underneath the fish was Levine's wedding ring. The couple had seen the Facebook post and returned it to him. Levine publicly thanked Gary, Emma, and the fish. In 2012, Deb Thompson bought a pair of secondhand capri pants from a Goodwill store in Minnesota and paid a whopping $3.99. When she tried them on later, she reached into the pocket and found inside a diamond ring, which she had later appraised. It was worth somewhere between $5,000 and $6,500. Rather than quietly celebrating what could be considered the greatest bargain in Goodwill history, Thompson contacted the store and began trying to locate the original owner because, as she explained, she wanted to know the story behind the ring and make sure the person got it back. However, several people came forward to claim the ring, but no one was actually able to provide proof it was theirs. And finally, during a grueling multi-day ultra marathon through China back in 2016, runner Dion Leonard noticed a tiny little stray dog running beside him. The dog kept running and running. The little dog ultimately accompanied Leonard for most of the race, roughly 77 miles, even sleeping beside him at the camps. Leonard named her Gobi. And by the end of the race, Leonard had become so attached to her that he decided to bring her home to Scotland. And that in and of itself became an adventure when Gobi temporarily disappeared in China, prompting a major search. She was, or eventually found, reunited with Leonard, and currently is living in Scotland.
This has been today's edition of
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Random facts.
We began our discussion today with something I think almost all of us can agree on. We want people to suffer less. We want hungry people to have food. We want struggling families to find stability. And the disagreement isn't necessarily about whether we should care. It's just about how. Today, we've looked at two very different approaches. One approach places tremendous confidence in our ability to create systems capable of producing greater equality and meeting people's needs. The other begins somewhere much smaller, the human heart. Christianity, of course, doesn't promise that enough people become Christians, poverty would disappear, or suffering would disappear, greed would be gone. No, Jesus never promised any of that. What Christianity does offer is transformation. And it says that the greedy person can become generous. The selfish person can learn to serve. And the bitter person can forgive. And the person who once walked past suffering can become the person who stops. Now, if you're listening to this and you're just not sure what you believe about Christianity, maybe that's where I'd encourage you to begin is not with politics, not with denominations, and not with all the arguments people have had about religion. Start with Jesus. Read what he actually said. Watch how he treated people. The poor, the wealthy, the sick, the rejected, the religious, and the irreligious, the people everyone admired and the people that everyone avoided. And then just simply ask yourself a question. Is this the kind of person I would like to become? Ultimately, Christianity isn't simply a proposal for building a better society. It's an invitation to become a different kind of person, a person that recognizes that every human being has value, a person who understands that compassion and responsibility can exist together. And maybe that's where the difference between these two visions becomes the clearest. One asks, how much good can we accomplish by changing the structures around us? While Christianity asks, what might happen if God first changes us and then sends us back into those structures? Our families, the businesses, our communities, our government, our neighborhoods, to bring something different with us. If you'd like to talk to somebody and ask the tough questions about faith and a relationship with Jesus, I encourage you to call this number, 888-NEED-HIM, 888-NEED-HIM. There is always someone willing to talk with you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Again, that number, 888-NEED-HIM. I'm Seth Mila. Thank you so much for spending some time with me, and I look forward to the next time that we can get together. Take care. If you have questions or comments regarding today's show, or perhaps you'd like to suggest a topic for us to explore in a future program, please email me at sethmilamedia@gmail.com. That's sethmilamedia@gmail.com. This program was sponsored in part by Audio Imaging Solutions, LLC. Your message professionally crafted and delivered. For professional voice work, go to audioimigingsolutions.com. That's audioimigingsolutions.com.